My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope. So, Beef Pork Ribs, it would be uncouth of us to begin this episode without at least acknowledging the passing away of Chadwick Boseman.
It was one of those things I don't know. The first I saw of it was a post on Facebook, and I had mixed feelings about it because it was like great loss for Marvel fans, and I'm like, yeah, but also, you know, his family, his friends, he's done other things with his career. Like, I don't know, it always feels a little bit weird when that's like the first thing that comes up is like, you know, the affiliation they have. But then again, I guess that was probably the same thing when Stan Lee passed away. Was everybody's like, oh no, all comic fans are in mourning. But I don't know, for him, I think maybe it's because he was younger and maybe he has more to his career than just Marvel Comics or something. I don't know. But it was, that's pretty sudden for somebody his age and pretty devastating too, you know. You never expect that kind of news. Like if somebody from the MCU were to die, you wouldn't have thought it was him.
Yeah, I was unaware he died of colon cancer. I was unaware he had any kind of illness at all. And it's true, most people, because Black Panther was such a huge success, so many people know him because of that role. And I'll admit, before he was in the Captain America movie, I'd never heard of him before, but you look at his career, he's actually, people call him like the biopic king because he's played a lot of like real life people. He played Jackie Robinson in a movie. He played Martin Luther King Jr. in a movie. I think he's played other like real life figures in movies as well. So he certainly had a career beyond the MCU. But I think because Black Panther made such an impact when it came out 2 years ago, and so many people like looked to that character as like the first time they felt that they were represented in movies and in superhero movies, like he got a lot of kind of attention, if you want to call it that. Very tragic. It's tragic when a person passes away so young, like he was in his early 40s. It's of course sad when anyone dies at any age of life, but it seems like the younger they are when they die, there's this idea that there's so much life that they had yet to live. So naturally, for someone as young as he was, it was very sad to hear.
I think it also depends on like where they're at in their creative career and process, and also like you said, I didn't know he was, you know, had any kind of illness either. Like I'm remembering when David Bowie died and he literally like made the music video for Lazarus like from the hospital where he was dying, and like people knew and people were kind of aware. Like I think that was more to the point than necessarily his age, was more the fact that he had like it was better known, it was kind of in the media a lot more. Like, you know, I don't know if Alex Trebek, God, I hope he's not dead as I say this, but like if he were to pass away, you know, most people would be like, oh yeah, it's been in the media for like what few years now that he's battling cancer, whereas this was just kind of out of nowhere.
Yeah, and of course I don't know what they're going to do with the MCU. Black Panther 2 is supposed to be coming out in a few years. I really don't. I would prefer if they actually don't recast T'Challa and just have Shuri become Black Panther like they've done in the comic books before. I think it would. I don't know. In my opinion, it would be in bad taste if they like tried to recast T'Challa at this point.
That's actually exactly what Mjolnir said when she first heard the news. Well, not the first thing she said, but like when we talked about it a little bit, and we're like, yeah, what are they going to do? And she's like, well, I hope they just make Shuri Black Panther instead. I didn't know there was actually a precedent for it, but it makes sense.
Yeah, she was only Black Panther for a short period of time before they put T'Challa back in the chair, but or in the role, I should say. But all I have to say,
But also,
news
the
from her
actress
day.
is well loved, so like so far, so it seems pretty logical.
Definitely. So, Chadwick Boseman, we are praying for your soul. May you rest in peace. And we actually have a special guest with us this week, someone who's been on the show a few times before. So we got to welcome back Michael Andrew to the Batjar podcast.
Oh, hi. I totally forgot that I was here, but thank you for welcoming me.
So, Michael Andrew, whenever we bring a guest back, we have to do the segment, What You Been Doing? So we got to ask, what kind of nerdy or geeky things have you been up to since you were last on the show?
Oh, wow. Um, I've been really into plants this past few months. I think as most people are. So I'm looking into propagating plants and growing them. It's still very early on, so I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but it's plants for me.
And I think we can let the listeners in a little secret. You and I now live together.
That's
Uh,
amazing. I hear your laughter all the time.
um, even as we record right now, we're not actually in the same room because the Zencastr works better when you're using different logins. So your bedroom, I believe, is directly above the room I'm in. So if you wouldn't mind just stomping on the ground so I can make sure. Yeah, yeah,
Can you
okay,
hear that?
okay. I
Okay.
heard it. I don't know, beef pork ribs, could you hear that?
Yeah, but I'm not sure whose. I think I was hearing it through his microphone, not yours. It's hard to tell.
Fair enough. So indeed, beef pork ribs. Michael Andrew and I are recording from the same location, just different rooms. He's literally on top of me in a metaphorical sense. Well, no, in a
Oh,
literal
no.
sense.
I don't yeah, that's a weird way of saying it, but it's true, physically.
Well, Michael Andrew, we're happy to have you with us for this week's episode. And because we now live together, perhaps we'll see you more regularly as I start indoctrinating you more into nerd and geek culture. Um,
That I hope so.
you've definitely been indoctrinating me into the coffee culture. I had
Hmm.
something today for the first time. What was it called?
An espresso tonic.
Espresso tonic. Beef pork ribs. Have you ever heard of espresso tonic before?
Is it like a gin and tonic with espresso instead of gin?
You know what? Yeah, basically, a higher amount of tonic compared to a gin and tonic. But yes, basically.
Context clues, my friends.
Anyway, it's very tasty. If you guys are coffee people or if you like your bubbly water like I do, it's like a marriage of two beautiful things. So that was our What You've Been Doing segment. Welcoming back Michael Andrew. And now we're talking this week about the New Mutants and the movie that just came out. So this is really the first time we've actually discussed the New Mutants as a franchise. So that means we have to do our secret origin segment, discussing how each of us were first introduced to this franchise. So, Michael Andrew, you're our guest today. So, how were you first introduced to the New Mutants?
I think I watched a trailer when I was watching. I forgot what it was. It was in the theaters, and I saw it. I thought it was a horror movie at first. That's kind of how they portrayed it. So I was intrigued by it, but other than that, nothing else.
Beef pork ribs. How were you introduced to this franchise?
So before the trailer, I was aware that there was a Marvel movie, well, like Fox movie with Marvel characters, that was being made, um, because I love Maisie Williams. She's a great actress, and she's part of the reason why I kept watching Game of Thrones. Large reason, actually. And yeah, and she's in the movie, and I was like, and I was very excited because there's been, I mean, she kind of said that she would probably never get cast in most Hollywood movies because she didn't have the right kind of figure for it at some point, and I thought it was nice to see that she is actually doing things, and yeah, I got super excited about it, and then I forgot about it, And then Mjolnir was like, "Oh yeah, there's a new mutant movie that's coming out, and I want to see it." And then I remembered about it, watched the trailer again, and was like, "Oh yeah, this does look like a horror movie." Um, and then did not do much more research. We went to see it, but Mjolnir spent the entire like evening after we went to see it. Went to see it in theaters at like 4:30, and she spent the entire rest of the day reading off Wikipedia articles on characters from it. So I've picked up a bit more, but not much because she was kind of rambling for most of it. If you're listening, I love you. But yeah, that's pretty much me. Like I was aware they existed, vaguely aware of that they were kind of like my understanding was that they were like which isn't really what's in the movie, but they're like the B team X-Men kind of thing. And yeah, that's that was my entire knowledge of them.
Yeah, kind of like you, beef pork ribs. I knew the name New Mutants, and I knew it was something that was related to X-Men, and it was like one of many Marvel Comics characters I had never really invested in at all. Like I was an X-Men fan through the animated series, and I have picked up the occasional X-Men comic book over the years, but if you've ever tried reading X-Men comics, there's just so many of them, and there's literally like so many characters that it's kind of insane how big the franchise is. And I was reminded this week how I was probably really introduced to the New Mutants characters is there was an X-Men show in the early 2000s called X-Men Evolution. It was an animated series that was produced with voice actors from Vancouver, and it kind of portrayed all of the X-Men as teenagers. And they had like at a certain point in the show, they introduced like a new group of like as you would say the B team, and they were all characters from like the New Mutants from the comics. So but I kind of forgot that's how I was introduced them until yesterday, and I was like, oh yeah, that's why I have a vague recollection of who these people are because I saw them in an X-Men show like almost 20 years ago.
I did not
And
know they were in X-Men Evolution.
yeah, they come off as like minor characters like in season 2. There's like the girl who like she's called Boom Boom and she's got little exploding balls of energy and stuff, and Iceman is introduced as part of the like this group of characters in that particular show. But I digress. I really did not know much more about the New Mutants until the movie was originally announced. And when the first trailer did come out, it was pitching it like a horror movie. And I was like, well, I'll eventually see this, but it didn't seem like my cup of tea. So, getting into a bit of the origin of the actual comic book series, The New Mutants, as we've said, it's related to the X-Men series. And it's kind of noteworthy because this was the first official spin off of the X-Men. If you've ever again if you've read X-Men comics, you know that there's a lot of different X-Men comic books, and so it's kind of hard to imagine there was a time when there was only a single X-Men series being published, like the Uncanny X-Men. That was kind of it. But in 1982 there was this idea of introducing like a new class of X-Men characters, a group of teenagers. Even though like the original group of X-Men from like the early 60s were all teenage or young adults, they as X-Men kind of went on, they all became like full on adults, and it got to the point where Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters was basically more like just like a I guess like an apartment building for a bunch of adults who were part of the X-Men living together, and there really weren't any gifted youngsters around. So they Marvel Comics decided it's time to introduce a new group of X-Men characters who are indeed teenagers. They actually got Chris Claremont, who was the writer that brought X-Men back to popularity, to write this new series, and an artist named Bob McCloud to draw it. So just like the previous reintroduction of the X-Men, they introduced a diverse group of characters from different ethnic origins, and it sort of took off and became its own success. And that has led to many other X-Men spin-offs over the years. I think the most famous thing the New Mutants as a comic book series ever did is it was the first appearance of Deadpool in issue 98. That's probably like the biggest claim to fame New Mutants as a series will ever have, is that it introduced Deadpool.
That's a pretty big claim to fame.
And like most Marvel Comics team books, the roster of like who was actually appearing in the book changed a lot over the years, and they had It's one of those Marvel series that has stopped and started again. Like there's very few Marvel Comics characters and DC Comics characters as well who like have continually been published without any stoppage. So I think there's been at least 3 times now, 3 or 4 times where New Mutants like stopped publishing and then someone came along and said, "Let's try this again." So it's I guess you could say it's somewhat popular, but it hasn't been so popular that it's stuck around continuously. And Michael Andrew, you've never been a big comic book person, so is it surprising for you to learn that New Mutants has been around since the early 1980s?
Not really. I feel like there's a ton of comic books that have gained popularity, um, and kind of gone away, and then are now coming back. So, but I do like the idea of introducing new characters and um, having them kind of like graduate. It really is a story about like childhood and coming of age, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, beef pork ribs. This whole idea of like they talk about the whole X-Men storyline and the idea of mutants as like a stand-in for puberty. So do you think that the X-Men storyline, if you will, with like mutant powers actually works better when all the characters are teenagers?
I think there's like yes and no. I think the thing about it is that, like this movie clearly indicated, that's kind of become like the canon is that puberty is what affects it, which I think came out of that idea. Um, and I honestly don't feel like it's necessary to have that analogy exactly, especially because I feel like Marvel has gone a long way with um with the mutants and the kind of the evolution of their place in the canon and what they represent and what they do. So I think that even though having them be teenagers, I think was good for different reasons, especially because it is kind of like trying to usher in a new generation, which is what the New Mutants was trying to do, and like it's showing that people are willing to actually go beyond just always having exactly the same um, mutants. I think like the idea of making them teenagers was less of a good choice thematically and more of a good choice for where kind of like we're at with them at like with X-Men as a franchise, especially in the movie world. Um, particularly with Hugh Jackman having finally retired as Wolverine, it kind of leaves it open to like not do Wolverine centric X-Men and to have kind of like the mutants evolve and be like kind of be their own thing.
Fair enough. And as we're going to start talking about this movie, we'll find out if this was a good adaptation of that concept or not. So, in order to start talking about this movie, we have to go back to the year 2015. So, if you guys can put your brains back into that time period and think about what the situation was like for 20th Century Fox producing Marvel Comics movies. At that point, they had released Days of Future Past the year before, which was a huge success. And they were in the middle of producing Deadpool, which at that point was still a big wild card. They weren't sure if it was going to be a success or not. And so it seemed as though 20th Century Fox had some direction about where they were going to go with their X-Men movies. They had announced a Gambit movie starring Channing Tatum that was supposed to come out in 2016 as well. And this was at that point when you really saw like the 3 different movie studios who had access to Marvel Comics characters trying to hold on to those characters for dear life. You had Marvel Studios, who had just done Age of Ultron. You had 20th Century Fox, who was doing X-Men and Fantastic Four. And then you had Sony, who was doing Spider-Man. So in 2015, at this point when Fox seemed to be getting their kind of, they like were establishing like their kind of stakeholding in their X-Men properties, they went and released Fantastic Four, or Fan Four Stick as people call it. And we all know that movie was terrible. Um, but it was at this time in 2015, hot off the heels of Days of Future Past doing so well, that writer director Josh Boone made a pitch to the people at Fox saying, I want to do a movie, not just a movie, a trilogy about the New Mutants, and I want it to be focused on like young adults, and I want to have a horror bend to it. And his thinking was that at that point there hadn't been really any X-Men movies that focused on exclusively on young adult characters, and that exploring, I guess, the horror genre through superhero movies was something that hadn't been done before and would help them stand out among all the other superhero movies. Does it surprise you guys at all that Fox agreed with this guy's pitch and went ahead with it?
It actually doesn't surprise me, just because during that time, the X Men property that Fox had was doing fairly well, if I'm not mistaken, and they were going into different avenues where they were more experimental, especially with Deadpool being the rating that it got. They were really being experimental, and they had, I don't know if there's some statistical backing for it to why they're doing it, but they were finding success. So it made sense that they really squeezed everything they had with the X Men property. So
I think the other thing is that was also the time where they were like people were trying to get Marvel back under one banner, and I do think that doing a horror genre was proving that you couldn't like it was a way to ensure that these characters couldn't just be shoot into the general superhero movie, but also a way to actually make them more relevant and make them something different when there was such an oversaturation of superhero movies being made. So I'm not surprised that they went with it at all. I mean, also, yes, trying to keep the X-Men franchise, especially because like the X-Men were going towards a reboot. They were trying to recast people. At that point, I don't know where the Wolverine or where Logan was in production, but let's be honest, everybody knew that um, Hugh Jackman couldn't keep being Wolverine forever, and they were trying to get new stars to represent the franchises. And I think that actually the cast that they got for this movie are good rising stars, younger actors that are still talented, and I think it was a great idea to like kind of try to focus around that, and even maybe try to capitalize a little bit on the young adult um, market, which wasn't really being directly hit by superhero movies. So I think it was a lot of diversity, and if if what was pitched is close to the movie that we got, then I think it makes sense to have gone with it because the movie worked for those things and kind of accomplish what I think that vision was trying to go forward with. Now, obviously, it took a long time to get there, and I don't know if it's still going to be as efficient, but I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Yeah, this movie has a very complicated production history. So it was greenlit in 2015, and at that point they were working on X-Men Apocalypse. So the first draft of the story actually incorporated the continuity of X-Men Apocalypse. The idea was that it was going to be taking place 3 to 4 years after that, so like late 80s. And there was actually like Storm was written into the movie. James McAvoy as Professor Xavier is written into the movie. The Easter egg, or I should say, the post-credit scene of X-Men Apocalypse involving the Essex Corporation was tied into the movie. And so it was really like Fox trying to create like an established cinematic universe between their movies. But in 2016, X-Men Apocalypse came out and it was received poorly, financially and critically. So Fox backpedaled on all those elements. They kind of wrote out all those connective tissue elements. They got rid of James McAvoy's role and Storm's role, and they tried to like make it as separate as possible. And they even like moved the setting to present day so that way it would not be associated with those bad movies. Um, the initial release date was set for April 2018, and there was a teaser trailer that came out. I think it was like either late 2017, early 2018, because they actually filmed this thing in the year 2017. Because again, Greenland 2015, script written in 2016, filmed in 2017, with an April 2018 release date in mind. And they put out the first teaser trailer, which really kind of overemphasized how much horror elements there were in the movie. And that trailer got a positive response from people. They were like, "This is great! Like, this is what we're looking for." And so the studio and the director kind of like realized, oh, like this trailer is overselling how much horror there is in the movie. We're going to need to do some like reshoots to kind of include more horror elements because that's what people like. And so it seemed pretty much right away, even though they'd finished filming the movie, there was the decision that was going to be made. Okay, we need to reshoot scenes and add more content to make the film scarier. Because if we release the movie as it is, people will be disappointed. Now, when a movie changes release dates, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's things outside of their control. And the kind of the big shadow that has fallen over this New Mutants movie has everything to do with the Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox, because that deal was announced in December 2017. After the trailer had come out, after they'd finished filming, they were on schedule to release this thing in April. Well, in January 2018, 3 months from when the film was supposed to be released, it was decided that the movie was actually going to have its release date changed to February 2019. And the reason they gave for changing the release date is because they had changed the release date of Deadpool 2, and they didn't want two of their Fox X-Men movies to be coming out during the same kind of period of time. They wanted to really like create that distance. They didn't want them essentially competing with themselves. It's hard to tell like how much of that first release date change was based on the fact they wanted to do reshoots, because the official reason says it's because they wanted to get away from Deadpool 2's changed release date. But we can all presume that the reshoots had something to do with it. So February 2019 was supposed to be the next release date for the movie. So it initially got moved ahead almost a year. And then 2 months later, in March 2018, the release date was changed again to August 2019. And this was announced because the release date for Dark Phoenix, which was supposed to be in November 2018, was pushed to February 2019. So naturally, they didn't want two of their X-Men movies coming out at the same time. So New Mutants got pushed from February 2019 to August 2019.
Honestly, that's the one that puzzles me a little bit. I don't know, were they expecting Dark Phoenix to do well? I feel like it was I would have maybe pushed that one back further and released New Mutant then to get a little bit more of, to get the taste of Apocalypse away a little bit, especially because, I don't know, historically, trying to do big, important comic storylines in movies has been terrible. I mean, Apocalypse, Age of Ultron, even to some, like, Civil War worked for what it was. It was a terrible adaptation of like the Civil War storyline. Like, they should have seen it coming that Dark Phoenix wouldn't be great, and I feel like rebooting or getting a new series out would have been a much better idea at that point, but maybe that's just me.
Well, and Dark Phoenix's release date changed again as well. It went from November to February to June. So it didn't come out eventually till June 2019. And it's, again, the speculation, because of course none of this is official, but the speculation is that because Disney was kind of starting to manage the business side of Fox, as they were kind of like involved in these decisions, and there were reshoots that they did on Dark Phoenix as well, which helped push its release date farther away. And I guess because New Mutants was less of a it was less of a known thing. Like no one had seen any of it before. Where at least they're Jennifer Lawrence and some of these other people were big names. I guess they thought that was better to prioritize Dark Phoenix over.
They were wrong.
Yeah. Okay, so we're
Hot
now.
take, sorry. They were wrong.
Yeah, no, you can imagine if you were a fan of this franchise and you were looking forward to this movie in a span of 3 months, really, you go from, oh, I'm going to see this movie in 4 months. Oh, okay, I'm actually going to see this movie in 10 months. Oh, okay, I'm actually going to see it in a year and a half. And then in April 2019, which is kind of like a whole year past when the last release date change was set for, the Disney Fox acquisition was approved, it was finalized, and then one of the first things they do as like the new parent company is they shift the release date from August 2019 to April 2020. At this point, I still don't know what the inspiration was at that point for moving the release date ahead again. Uh, their thinking is, I read something that suggests that they still hadn't done any of those reshoots, that basically because of all the shifting going on with Disney and Fox, that they'd kind of paused any work on the movie. And so maybe they were thinking, oh, well, now we can do the reshoots and get all that kind of squared away so we can make it the movie that people think it is. I remember though at this point, I'm like, this is the fourth release date for this movie. Like I was really questioning if it was ever going to come out.
Yeah, it was.
Michael,
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, like, it was. I think a lot of people had kind of forgotten about this movie by the time it came out because of that, and like, yeah, and even I think we made a joke on the podcast earlier about its release date getting pushed back, and we were saying like maybe it won't come out. Like this will be the next movie we make if. Yeah, it was just so much crazy things.
Michael Andrew, as someone who doesn't really follow the movie business, what's your reaction to hearing this movie's release date continually changing?
My main the main thing that came to my mind is the fact that it kind of lost steam when it was initially put out, or like the trailer was initially put out. It was kind of like a new thing. It's a new adaptation for something that people have been seeing for years. And I think when I first saw the trailer, I was actually kind of excited for it, even though I'm not a big horror fan. It did excite me, but by them continuing to push it back, um, you kind of just lose steam and people just lose interest. People don't have enough attention span to keep up with news, and this movie just seems like any other horror movie with a twist to it. So it is disappointing that they pushed it that far back, and for for seemingly very uh, few reasons for it. So
And in April 2019, that was the month Avengers Endgame came out. Like nobody was talking about anything else. So it really like if it wasn't for the fact that I was scrolling through news sites every day and I saw that announcement of it being shifted again, I wouldn't have noticed. And I will give them some credit because the release date changed for a fifth time, and this was obviously something beyond their control because in March 2020, COVID-19 happened, and basically every movie studio took every movie off their release schedule. And so 1 month before the movie was supposed to finally see the light of day, a global pandemic came along and said, "Sorry, New Mutants, you're not going to get a theatrical release." And it was like most of Fox's movie was just removed from the release schedule altogether. And it was unclear as like when are we ever going to see movies again? And so it was announced sometime this summer that it was going to get released in theaters at the end of August. And people were skeptical. They're like, there's no way they're actually going to put movies in the theater at that point. It won't be safe to go to the movie theaters. Um, People were advocating, it's like, just send this movie to a streaming service. Like, don't put it in theaters. Like, kind of bury it or somewhere because it's like this relic of a past franchise, basically. And we'll talk about that as we get into it because really, this is essentially the final X-Men Marvel movie produced by Fox. It is now being released under the umbrella of 20th Century Productions. I noticed that at the theater, the normal Fox title card doesn't even have Fox on it anymore. It says 20th Century Productions. And we've been told that Marvel Studios has plans for the X-Men characters, so this really does feel like a leftover of something that's gone by. I did clarify through different articles, but they never did actually film any reshoots for the movie. By the time they finally got to actually working on the movie again, the director felt that the actors had all aged enough that they looked too different and it just wouldn't work. And fair, it had been like essentially 2 years since they had filmed the thing. And so I guess the only final round of edits removed some of the Marvel references because they were thinking let's make it as like let's not even say the word X-Men. And obviously that they still reference the X-Men in the movie, so that is what it is, but All that to say, we're going to start talking about this movie for realsies now. We've gotten through all the history and all the annoyances of the release date finally changing because it did actually come out this past weekend. Beef pork ribs, if you had to guess, what do you think the critics are saying about this movie on Rotten Tomatoes?
Ooh, on Rotten Tomatoes, that's putting it on a different uh, standard than I normally do. Um, I'm guessing it's got to be pretty, like, fairly good. I mean, I'm guessing also, like, criticisms on Rotten Tomatoes tend to go for some of the things that this movie did pretty well and seem to appreciate. I think, like, on the whole, I do appreciate that it was actually, after hearing kind of the history, that they did stick with kind of the original script or the original concept, because I think it held perfectly well on its own for what it was. So I'm guessing positive reviews generally, maybe not overwhelmingly so, because there were a few things that, were a little problematic. But I feel like most of them had to do with it, like with the fact that it wasn't placed in the universe it thought it was going to be.
So currently it has 31% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Really? Huh.
Now, part of the theory here is that generally the tomato meter is populated by movie critics, and in order for critics to get their rating up by the time the movie's released is that they have like these press screenings where like the studio will show the movie for members of the press so that they can like put their reviews out when the movie comes out for the public. But apparently Fox, Disney, whoever is making this movie, they didn't do any press screenings. They intentionally didn't, like, they decided not to do it. And so it's possible that there's movie critics who've seen the movie and like it but just haven't had the chance to actually put their reviews online yet because it's only been 2 days since the movie was released. And to be honest, that's usually a tactic a studio goes with when they think the movie's no good. They intentionally delay showing it to critics because they're afraid that if the movie gets bad press before it is even released, then people don't go see it.
I don't know. I feel like it something about that does kind of ring true in the fact that, like, I can see why they do that, but I don't know. I didn't think it was like 31% is really low.
Yeah, Michael Andrew, how do you feel about that 31%?
I do think it's fairly low. It might also just be that the audience is just so used to superhero movies being so extravagant in its budgets, in its production, in its storyline that something a bit more simplified just appears lacking. Because personally, I wanted to like it just for the storyline and the direction that they were trying to take, and I do like it, but I don't think it goes above and beyond um, a typical quote unquote a typical superhero movie nowadays tends to do. So I think that might be the case. I feel like that would be the case if I were to rate it anything lower than 40% or something like that on Rotten Tomatoes. So
Yeah, the audience score is 53% on Rotten Tomatoes. So like 31 is the critics, 53% is the audience. I'm also seeing there's less than 1,000 audience reviews. So this is kind of leading into the box office of it, is that the reality is it's really hard to tell if this movie did poorly or if it's just a reality that not many people are feeling comfortable going back to the movies yet. Because this opening weekend, it's only made about $7 million, which, comparatively, like most of these superhero movies will at least make 30 or 40 or 50 million its opening weekend. Whereas again, this is seven, and it's really hard to tell, I think, if this is a result of just low movie attendance from the pandemic or if it was just the super low interest in this movie.
I'd be inclined to say it's probably low for the critics, but also there's another kind of like skewing to the statistics right now, is that most likely the people who went to see it were people who were very excited about it and who want probably or at likely wanted it to be better or to be a real hard reboot or wanted, like, if they had very high expectations and that's why they went to see it right away, that could potentially explain why they, were a little, why they were disappointed in it. Or, it's the only movie other than Tenet that's out right now, and people are like, yeah, back to the movie theaters, I want a cinematic experience. And to be fair, like, the visual effects I think were great and the sound was really good, but I don't think that's the kind of movie you'd go to get your cinematic experience back.
Yeah, and Tenet's not even released in the United States yet. It's released in Canada and other countries, but it's not there yet. So it's yeah, it's hard to tell, and that's okay for now. But Beef Pork Ribs, why don't you give us the Twitter tweet summary of the movie's storyline?
New mutants are dangerous. That's why you're here.
Ooh, scary.
This isn't a hospital. It's a cage. Together, we can get out of here.
That thing will kill you!
He's right, it's Mate. So am I.
The New Mutants.
That was so hot.
Rated PG-13, April 3rd.
Teenage mutants in the Marvel universe somewhere are being experimented on, and it's spooky. No, wait. Let me redo that a little bit. That is actually fairly accurate, but a young woman is struggling to control her powers, even in the forceful presence of others who are in a similar situation, while being shadowed by a mysterious overlooker and her even more mysterious superiors.
So I would say this movie has good ideas, but it was poorly executed.
I can see that. I don't know what you. It depends what you mean by poorly executed. I honestly, a lot of the parts were executed quite well, just maybe not to the level of detail one would have expected. Like, I think poor execution is a little bit strong for kind of what was wrong with the movie. Like, there were definitely things that were wrong with the movie and that didn't deliver quite what one might have expected. But I don't know if I'd say necessarily poorly executed. I think definitely this movie could have benefited from a couple reshoots and perhaps some extra scenes to kind of cover it, but also a lot of things. I don't know. There might be a lot of things that were cut that would have made it kind of rounded it up better, but that couldn't be put in because it is no longer kind of part of another cinematic universe.
The really good idea they have here is what is the teenage experience of developing these superpowers if you've actually experienced any trauma in your life, and specifically if you've done something or you've experienced trauma, I should say, as a result of having these powers. I think that's a good idea, and I think it, but I just don't think they go far enough with it here. This movie feels, it reminded me a lot of the movie Glass, the kind of like sequel to the M. Night Shyamalan shared universe of his superhero movies, where it's just a bunch of people in a hospital the whole time. And it just, like, there's one doctor there, there's no other staff, they're locked in. It's just,
I
Personally,
guess I see what you
oh,
mean. Yeah,
sorry.
go for it.
I agree with both average and beef pork ribs here, where I'm actually looking forward to seeing the deleted scenes. I feel like you just needed some character development and character growth to increase your buy-in to each characters. And I think we would have been emotionally invested more, and I think that would have carried a lot more weight because the movie itself is done well. It could have been better, sure, but I think it's been done well. It achieves its promise, but our usual investment in characters are usually done through individual movies for each superhero, right? But for this one, there wasn't enough on each individual. Even the leading mutant, if you could call her a leading mutant, Danny, there wasn't a lot of backstory, so it was hard for you to invest in that person. So I'm hoping with the deleted scenes or the reshoots or whatever they may have, like it kind of tells a more in-depth story for each character.
I think I'm realizing, having seen this movie just after talking about the Umbrella Academy, I see parallels where when I started watching the Umbrella Academy, I knew nothing about any of the characters, and so you're learning their backstories and what their powers are through like these, through episode upon episode of like learning their stories. And this is kind of the same thing where it's like, okay, what's your trauma and like what's your power? And based on these little nuggets you're passing out as we're going through the movie, I'm having to piece together your story until you get to the moments where the characters just tell you their story. And I guess that's the result of this being like an ensemble film instead of a show, is that you have to have these scenes where the characters sort of tell you what happened to them. And yeah, I guess they do show you and not tell you what their powers are, but I don't know. I guess maybe I'm unfairly comparing it to the Umbrella Academy.
But like you just said, also the Umbrella Academy had an entire season to do that. Like I and I think we both agree that this movie needed a bit more time. Like I think everybody more or less said some variation of that. This movie needed a bit more time to do what it wanted to do. And that's why, like, when you said poor execution, I don't think the execution was necessarily poorly done. I think it was definitely missing something. Uh, but I think that what it was doing was definitely working. Um, it's just it needed a bit more, or maybe a little bit of a different uh, approach to some of the character development. But I don't like. I bought into the story and into the concept, and I think it worked out very well in the sense that, like, you got the emotional investment you thought you would get, and it like you got the emotional involvement you thought you would get from like what the story is trying to do. There were tie-ins that didn't really work, but that's because of where it was. But even just the references to the reference to Essex Corp, even though it seemed a little shoot in at that point, yes, that's because of the way this movie was set. It, unless you were a fan, it didn't mean anything to you. But at the same time, it's also like if you had more time to figure out um, what that was and what that represented. And I honestly thought that, like, at some point, Sunspot was going to mention that his family had dealings with them because he seemed to like recognize the name. And I thought there was like, if there was a bit more time to really explain these concepts and make them work, I definitely think it could have been exactly the movie I wanted it to be. But I don't think it. I feel like it's unfair to say it was poor execution. I think it was just not. There was just not enough there. It was more. It was lacking rather than like lacking something rather than um doing something wrong.
Yeah, I would have loved to see the reshoots because, frankly, I didn't think this movie was very scary. Like, I can see why they wanted to do the reshoots to make it more of a, as scary as a PG-13 movie can be, because it didn't. And most of the this isn't spoilery, but most of the scary elements are CGI, and I didn't think the CGI was very impressive in this movie. It was kind of like it was passable, but I'm supposed to be scared of something I can tell isn't there, and that it just didn't get me, if that makes sense.
I kind of agree. I will just say though that, or maybe we should wait until we get to spoilers for me to. There was something in the CGI that I actually thought was very well done.
I also I was mentioning this to Michael Andrew when we saw the movie, that it felt, some of the editing felt off. Like, cutting from one clip to the next, I was like, wait, what just happened? Like, they're wearing different clothes, or they're wearing different outfits, or the way that they stacked scenes next to each other. I was like, but wait, didn't that character say this other thing in the last scene that kind of contradicts what they just said now? It felt like it had been like kind of like, I don't know how to describe it. It felt like it had been edited a lot.
Yeah, I think the first scene that we recognized that was happening was when the girl with the sword,
Ilyana.
Ilyana. So that was the first scene that we recognized that there was some editing issues, or editing that editing may have because of the reshoots is when Ileana had her puppet, and the next scene showed that she just didn't have it anymore, and we thought that she lost it or it was like a really bad editing, and then the next thing you see it was in her pocket.
Yeah, I just want to get talking into some spoilers here. So, is there anything else, just generally, that is not spoilery you guys want to mention before we go into the spoilerverse?
Let's go dive right into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, we'll put a time code in the description of the episode if you want to skip around spoilers. If you don't want to be spoiled at all before seeing the New Mutants. So, we're inside the spoilerverse now. We're talking about spoilers. I want to just first go beef pork ribs to what you said about Sunspot or not Sunspot. No, yeah, Sunspot. There's another character in X-Men called Sunfire that I was getting them confused. But Sunspot, apparently at one point in the production there was an idea of doing a post-credit scene with Sunspot's dad, who was going to be played by Antonio Banderas, and it was supposed to tie like a future connection to the Essex Corporation and eventually to Mr. Sinister. So that idea was in flux at one point, but the director felt that by the time they were at that point, it just didn't make sense because there was no guarantee that this series would continue, and he was like, "We'll just not do it."
That makes sense because it really it felt like that, and I don't know if you guys saw that, but I thought yeah, I saw something like in his eyes when they were talking about like almost like it was like recognition, which is why I was a little bit weirded out that it didn't amount to any more than that, but ha, it was supposed to, um, and I don't know, there were so many things that could have kind of added to it that I think are kind of unfortunate that they didn't spend more time um yeah, we're into spoilers now. Like the relationship between Rain and Danny, like it flowed organically enough for a movie. Obviously it could have been a lot better, but it also could have been a lot worse. Like when you think of like movie relationships, I don't think it was like super clumsy. I think it was, cute enough, and it worked with the way their characters were or had been established that I don't think it was like yes, it would have been nice to have a bit more time with them, but I don't think it was like necessary to have that. So I don't know. There were a lot of things that just seemed like a little bit more time would have helped out. But to get to the spoilery thing I was going to talk about, um, the first appear like maybe I'm biased because I recently watched the Slender Man movie, and that movie, like you were talking about horror and what is or isn't scary, that movie was not scary even remotely. But the smiling men in the movie when they first appeared, took off their mask, that I thought that they were legitimately terrifying. So I don't know, maybe that's just me. Maybe I find that inherently more creepy than most normal human beings would, but I thought that was really well done.
I mean, to me, they just looked like Venom without eyes.
But it's not necessarily just about the design, but also like the speed at which they came at you was very unnerving. And I think I don't know, I find that a lot scarier than a lot of other horror tropes that exist.
What was confusing for me is like the five main characters, they kind of go through these different waves of like how engaged they are in being part of this program or how engaged they are in being at this facility. Like there's scenes stacked on top of each other where like Cannonball in one moment's like, oh, I don't want to be anywhere else, like I want to live my whole life here, and then the next scene he's like, I want to get out of here, I want to leave now, like why are you keeping me here? And I was like, didn't you just say you wanted to stay here forever? Like, and even Danny, like her character confused me so much because, and I get like she was going through a lot, but like it seemed like she was almost like a different character in every scene she was in. It's like one scene she's like shy and reserved, and then another scene she's like more open, and then another scene she's like angry. Um, I yeah, and I get her powers were at play, and like didn't have any control over it, but it did almost feel like a bunch of like short films kind of like munched together. And I don't know how much of that was just like they didn't film everything they wanted to, or however you want to explain that away. But yeah, I found Danny's character kind of inconsistent in the way that she was experiencing everything. Like in one, she gets there and she wants to commit suicide 'cause she's like, I don't want to be here. I want to be with my family. And Rain convinces her to not do that, and then she opens up to the idea. She gets bullied anyway.
I feel like maybe there was a little bit missing, but I feel like Cannonball's reasoning changed based on information change a little bit more than like. I agree, Danny was a little bit weird, and I did find that Ilyana once or twice her character changed a little bit too much. Like she went from being completely like, um, well, the one scene where Danny steals Lockheed and then comes to, and she almost like she looks like she's about to kill Danny, and then Danny comes to return Lockheed, and she doesn't immediately say "Where's Lockheed?" and attack her. She's just like there on her own and kind of being more vulnerable.
One thing I will complain in this movie and here in the spoiler verse is that in the comic books, Wolfsbane or Rain's character, she's from Ireland, and her whole thing is that essentially she's kind of like run out of town by an angry mob who thinks she's possessed by a demon, and it's at that point she's discovered by an associate of Professor Xavier, and she goes and joins the New Mutants. And a move that I think was just dumb. They kind of replace the angry mob with a priest in the movie, and so it kind of just accentuates this horrible stereotype of like the abusive priest who like brands her and like calls her a demon and all this stuff. And so you see that's like her specific trauma in the movie, is that she's haunted by like the ghost of this priest she had to kill. And I just don't appreciate when a movie kind of perpetuates this stereotype of like, ooh, the evil priest.
She's actually well from Scotland in the comics, not Ireland, but I'm nitpicking. But it is kind of weird also because like canonically, I believe she was raised by like the minister wasn't the guy who like drove her out of town. It was the guy who raised her and actually her biological father or something. I believe, I can't remember. I think it's her biological father and her mother was a sex worker. So it was kind of a weird situation. Um, but on the flip side of that, like I agree with you, it was not a great stereotype. But on the flip side of that, and this is something that like Mjolnir was also pointing out, like it is nice to see that there was a representation where like she still believed in a way, like her faith wasn't completely destroyed by that experience. And I think that it obviously doesn't counteract the terrible stereotype, but it does kind of like show that at least there was something kind of a hopeful side to it, that even though she had gone through this great abuse, it also she was able to still keep her faith and to disassociate the action of one person from um, the actual teachings. And I think that was
And
kind of a
I'll
cool
agree
thing to
with that.
have.
I think that is like the silver lining in that element of her story. It certainly. I think I would have enjoyed this more if it was part of some larger universe, whether it was like the Fox X-Men or if they found a way to somehow rope this into the MCU. Because on its own, like disconnected from everything else, I mean, the fact that this is going to be just a one and done movie, like that's it. This is over. You'll never see these characters again. I think that colors my overall impressions. Like it's like, yeah, that was an hour and a half of my time that I'll never have a reason to be invested in this story again. So that's I don't know. Maybe again, I'm just so used to this idea of the shared universe now that anything that is totally divorced and on its own. But then at the same time, Joker is not related to anything DC's putting out, and I thought that was like a very powerful experience as a movie. So again, maybe I'm unfairly comparing this to other movies.
I'd actually like to say that's a fair statement to make, just because both beef pork ribs and I's opinions on it is the development of the characters and the things that are missing. Right, I'm looking forward to seeing the deleted scenes, but a movie shouldn't rely on the deleted scenes to make a movie complete. So I agree, in your opinion, Average Joe, that if there was a bigger universe, or if this was connected to a bigger universe, I would, instead of me looking forward to the deleted scenes, I would be looking forward to the character development for when I see these characters in a different movie or the second movie that comes out under the same name.
And I think for myself, like, yeah, it's I guess I hadn't given it that level of thought. The fact that this is going to be disconnected and that we're in, 99% likely not going to see these characters again, but that doesn't necessarily spoil my enjoyment of the movie. It does make me kind of sad to think about it because I do think that there were some great performances in this movie and that this was definitely going somewhere and somewhere that could sustain, a good follow up. And also, like, I do appreciate they got younger actors, not just because, it comes back to the roots of X-Men and being a teenager and discovering your power, but also because these are like young and talented actors that could carry a franchise for a number of years to come. And I guess I hadn't really thought about that, but I don't think it spoiled my overall enjoyment of the movie. Yes, I agree. I think, and I said it a number of times with Michael Andrew, like it was missing something, and it could have been better if it was given kind of probably the reshoots, or if it was maybe there's some scenes that were referencing other things too much. But um, yeah, I think that it might be a little bit unfair to compare it to Joker, knowing what's happened. But you're right. On its own, it doesn't stand as a great, amazing movie. But I still enjoyed it personally, and you know, I would love to see a sequel to it, even though it probably never will. But I would love to see a sequel to it. I appreciated it, and I like what it was doing. I just needed a bit more.
I totally agree. It leaves me wanting for more like character development. I want to know the characters more because it is an interesting concept. It's an interesting story, and the dynamics is also interesting. So I definitely would love to see the characters in different movies again. But with how the movie's doing in the box office, that seems doubtful right now.
This movie has the cinematic debut of Lockheed, who's in the comic books is like an alien dragon who hangs out with Shadowcat, and in this movie he's mostly a hand puppet. And when he finally does like show up, like fully realized, I was like, well, it's better than nothing. But it was just the sock puppet or hand puppet Lockheed was just another example of how generally the Fox X-Men movies were always afraid to go full into being a comic book movie. They always had to keep like one foot out of the water and make it more like real world. Uh, Again, this might be a nitpick and me just having like decades of experience with the Fox X-Men movies, but that's my final little nitpick there about Lockheed.
I will say one thing about Lockheed and Ileana generally is that, but the X-Men, like yes, the Fox X-Men movies kind of sometimes stayed away from that, but even the MCU stayed away from magic for a while. And Lockheed, even though yes, he's technically an alien, like what he was doing with Ileana's powers are magic. Like she's done, all kinds of magic because I think her mutant power is just teleportation. So it is kind of like it didn't fit super well for him to be. And I do actually think that because they were putting the emphasis on like drama and how it affects you, him being mostly a hand puppet but also can come ahead, was good for the context of this movie. I agree, Lockheed probably should have been better, but at least we had that.
And before Gribbs, you mentioned something about the CGI that was spoilery.
Oh, I was just wanted to talk about the design of the Smiling Man and how I thought the way they moved and the way they looked was actually pretty good at being scary. The Demon Bear was what it was. It was passable. I liked that it became more and more like a bear as it went on. Like yeah, I know the idea of like being afraid of like a big shadow beast that can is kind of is amorphous isn't great. But it did become more and more bear, and I think that was a good thing as far as its design to make it more and more a not just a shadow monster hidden away, but a real shape. Like by the time it was attacking, it looked like a bear face came out, like a shadowy bear face, but it was a bear face coming out and grabbing the doctor.
So, coming around to final thoughts, having had this conversation, I think I have cooled down a bit on the New Mutants movie. I will say, like, it's very impressive. They have a very diverse cast of young actors playing these parts in a sense, more or less accurately to how their origins and stories work out in the comic books. Uh, it was okay. It You would think that like seeing any movie on the big screen again after being in shutdown for so long would like be amazing to me, but I walked away from this being like, that was okay. Like there were good ideas here, but because it isn't connected to anything else, and because I don't know, there the things that weren't perfect about it, I guess I have a very blasé kind of meh feeling about it. So I don't think I'm going to give this more than 2.7 out of 4 bat cookies.
Final thoughts, and I just remember the thing I was going to say earlier, so I'm just going to say it now. I am hopeful that maybe, like Harley Quinn after Suicide Squad bombed, was still picked up as being a character. I hope that some of these actors are still used to portray those characters in other movies because I think they deserve it and they did a really good job. And I'm super biased because I think Maisie Williams is amazing, but like Rain was a really well played out character. But final thoughts, yes, there were things missing in this movie, but I think there was enough elements of what it needed to be for it to still be worth seeing. And once again, we are living in a world of ever changing um, ways to make movies, and maybe there'll be a director's cut the way there was a Snyder cut for this movie. I doubt it. Doesn't have the same cult following, doesn't have the same and it's not Zack Snyder, but it would be nice. Maybe something like that could happen after there's a precedent set. So I think it's still hopeful. But yeah, there were definitely problems with this movie, but I still think I'd give it a solid 3.2 bet cookies. I actually enjoyed it quite a bit.
And that's a good point to clarify. Josh Boone, the director of this movie, has said that this like he's not pulling any like, oh, the studio took it away from me. He said like this movie is like his version of the movie. You know, barring the fact they never actually did any reshoots.
Similar to beef pork ribs, I'm hope I'm hoping that the characters and maybe even the new mutant project in general does get picked up. I do like the the ideas and the storyline and even the characters. Specifically like it because they do have an indigenous um, character as a superhero, and I think especially in today's social climate, it's kind of important to have people see themselves as heroes, right? And I love the different cultural aspect that comes along with it. So I was very interested in that, and I wish um, there was more stories, there's more character development, character growth, and even backgrounds. So I would love to see Disney, Marvel kind of be more adventurous and not keep things in the back burner for that long. Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for this. I think people's reviews so far are not very negative, so I'm hoping that something gets picked up.
And how many bat cookies are you gonna give it?
Ooh, I would give it a 2.9 out of 4.
There you go. Well, The New Mutants is now playing in theaters. If you feel comfortable leaving your house to go to the movies, you might enjoy this. There's some good ideas here, and you might like it more than I did.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at,
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at.
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
And this is when we would normally go inside the Bat Jar to pull at our topic for next time, but the new Bill and Ted movie is now in theaters, and so we're going to review it eventually. But to prepare ourselves, I have never seen either of the original Bill or Ted movies. So our episode next week is going to be getting into the original Bill and Ted movie and its sequel before we talk about the new one.
Excellent.
I don't know why you're making Wayne's World references right now, but very good. Michael Andrew, thank you for being part of the podcast this week. It was a pleasure to have you here once again.
It's good to be back.
And until next time, when we talk about the Bill and Ted movies, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
And I'm Michael Andrew.
Catch you on the flip side.
Be excellent to one another. Got it this time.
Now you hear me, and now you